Hello and welcome back. This is the week 2 lecture. So today we will do our best to conclude the narrative of Cabeza de Vaca. I sort of introduced it last week. We talked a little bit about some of the stuff going on early in the narrative, but we did not get very far. And like I said then, that really was by design. I wanted to make sure that everybody had enough time to really make some serious headway through the text. I know back in week 1, we maybe didn't get a chance to read a whole lot. I wanted you guys to read the critical introduction first, so that might have gotten us a little bit behind on the narrative itself, and that's fine. I figured we could catch up here in week 2, so hopefully by the time you are watching this, you have finished the book, or at least you are very close to finishing. I am going to be talking about the ending a little bit here today. So if I give away something, if I end up, spoiling the conclusion, that's not a huge deal unless it's a big deal to you personally, in which case you might want to go and finish up and return to this lecture a little bit later. But I'm not going to try to be comprehensive. I'm not going to cover every single thing that happens in the narrative. And typically, I don't do a lot of plot summary in these lectures. I don't generally find it necessary. I will do a little bit here today just to keep us oriented, and because sometimes the narrative can be strange and a little bit hard to follow. But I actually wanted to start today by talking a little bit about structure and the sequence of time. The ways that Cabeza de Vaca sort of handles time in this narrative. For the most part, as Adorno and Potts tell us in the introduction, for the most part, our narrator here, our author, mostly sticks with a linear, pretty straightforward narrative style. But there are some departures from the norm, and I wanted to point those out. Again, the editors do this in the intro, so this is a little bit of review, but just in case there's any lingering confusion, I just wanted to point out a particular place in the text where Cabeza de Vaca stops narrating his own experiences and begins to sort of summarize the experiences of others. And kind of true to form, he doesn't necessarily announce this transition. We already talked about this last week. He's a rather strange writer in many ways. He's a strange narrator because he often glosses over seemingly very important events, right? I mean, moments of great narrative import. I mentioned a few of these last week. When they make that initial navigation error in the Gulf of Mexico that causes them to go in the wrong direction and causes them to land in Florida instead of their desired destination in northeastern Mexico. He doesn't really explain what happens. He doesn't really dwell on that moment, which would generally be mined for, great drama and conflict in a more traditional fictional narrative. That's not what we're getting here. As we know, we talked about different ways that we can categorize this text. Some people see a lot of similarities to adventure stories here, like, sort of traditional fiction stories that feature a lot of, improbable events and action. But we have to keep reminding ourselves this is a letter of relation. This is sort of an official government document that Cabeza de Vaca is obligated to produce for the king as sort of a report on the Narvaez expedition, what they saw, what they did, and also he's explaining to the crown, or at least what this genre is supposed to do, is to give, crown governments a clear idea of, whether or not they should colonize a place, whether or not they should commit more resources to conquering this new land. But of course, this is a particularly weird letter of relation because it's not a typical expedition. All kinds of improbable things happen beyond the pale. So we've already noticed that, but there are all these moments where Cabeza de Vaca doesn't really give us the kinds of description, the kinds of details that we expect as experienced fiction readers. So I mentioned a few of those moments last week. There's some more that we can discuss this week, including the point where he gets reunited with his fellow survivors, Dorantes, Castillo, and of course Estevancio. He mentions this, he talks about it, he narrates it, but he doesn't dwell on the emotions of this moment. And we'll talk more about what makes that a sort of pivotal moment. I've always viewed that reunion, which appears roughly around the halfway point of the book, as really being a good sort of dividing line between what we might think of as like part one versus part two. I mentioned last week that we have to kind of find our own ways to break up this text. Whether it's using those descriptive chapter titles from that later edition, or maybe just finding our own breaks in the action. But if we were to divide this roughly in half, which is often what I like to do as a reader, we might view that sort of reunion scene as a pretty good place to stop, or a pretty good place to kind of notice a major change in the narrative. So this is around page 100, between like 100 and 110. A lot changes after that point. Once the survivors, the four of them sort of band together and escape southward down the Texas coastline, the whole nature of the narrative really changes. The story changes. And that's because the conditions for these four guys change quite a bit. They go from often being enslaved, often being sort of chased or persecuted to varying degrees, often in sort of harm's way. They transition from that kind of reality to a very different reality as they continue to move southward, as they eventually go into what is now Mexico, and they encounter a lot of different cultures, a lot of different groups of Native Americans, and their treatment, the treatment that the four Spaniards receive, improves markedly. Their social status changes, and that's what I want us to talk a little bit more about today. They go from being sort of marginalized back on the Texas coastline, back on Malhado, that they go from that sort of marginal status to a pretty important cultural and social status that they maintain within these later groups that they begin to interact with and live with. So, of course, that will change their material circumstances, and that will change their perspectives, no doubt. And we notice some pretty major changes in Cabeza de Vaca, the way he's describing things, the way he talks about Native Americans, and the way he talks about his own role within their societies. So we'll get into some of that today, but I just wanted to, use this pivotal sort of turning point around the midway point, slightly past the midway point of the narrative. Well, actually, it's right there, because the narrative begins around page 40. It concludes near page 180. So we really are near the midway point here at the moment of that reunion. But this also kicks off kind of a weird little stretch in terms of structure and how time is being treated. So I want to go back to what we were talking about a moment ago. And again, they discussed this in the intro, the fact that for the most part, Cabeza de Vaca does use a chronologically sort of straightforward, linear narrative style. And we've covered a lot of those initial events. The Narvaez expedition departs from Cuba in 1527. They accidentally land on the western coast of Florida near modern-day Tampa Bay. Then we follow their sort of tortured journey through the future state of Florida. They eventually go overland. They encounter various Native Americans. There's some conflict. There's violence. They don't really seem to have a clear sense of where they are. They know they want to go the way of Panuco, but there's, of course, disagreement and uncertainty about how exactly to do that. They eventually start heading north along sort of the Gulf Coast. They hear these rumors of a large, powerful society that's referred to in the book as Appalachian. Or Appalachian, depending on how you want to pronounce it. That's obviously sort of the root word that we get, that we use for the Appalachian Mountains. You guys might be familiar with those. They run throughout really the eastern part of the U.S., from Alabama all the way up to Maine. So historians think this larger sort of civilization was probably somewhere like in the Florida Panhandle, or maybe Georgia, like the modern day state of Georgia, maybe even the Carolinas. We're pretty sure it was sort of a large confederation of many different tribes, sort of a large, almost so almost like a small scale empire that had perhaps subsumed a lot of smaller groups. And were probably somewhere to the north of where the Spaniards were. The Spaniards never seemed really 100% sure about Appalachian. They might come across some of its settlements. They steal some corn at one point. But for the most part, their travels in Florida are kind of shrouded in a lot of confusion, mystery, and at times bloodshed. They build those rafts. They eventually get on the coast and start moving northward along the Gulf Coast through the Florida Panhandle, like we said last week, sort of underneath the modern day states of Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and then they end up in the Galveston Bay near modern day Texas. And that's where they sort of crash land, at least Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow survivors. A lot of other Spaniards have already died, drowned, been shipwrecked in various places by this point. But the survivors make their way to Mojado, which is an island in the Galveston Bay, not far from mainland Texas. And that's where they are for quite a while. So we've already experienced a lot of that. They land on Mojado, off the coast of Texas in 1529. Okay, so at this point, not long after landing there, Cabeza de Vaca gets separated from his fellow Spaniards, and he lives more or less alone with various Native American tribes for, I think they say in the book, about 4.5 years. There's some discrepancies between different accounts as to just how long it was. Again, I'm sure Cabeza de Vaca's conception of time probably got skewed over the course of his travels. But according to our editors, it was probably about 4.5 years from 1529 until the spring of 1533. That's when he's reunited with Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio, his fellow survivors. And there had been other Spaniards also living on Mojado, but various things happened to them. Many of them die, we can assume. So by the spring of 1533, there were probably some other survivors spread out, through, coastal Texas, maybe in some other places nearby. But our 4 survivors lose contact with anybody else by that point. But what happens once he gets reunited with the other guys, what Cabeza de Vaca does, without really telling us that he's going to do it, is he shifts from a strictly first-person narrative style to what might be characterized as kind of an unclear third-person style, because he starts to relate events that happen to other people, things that did not necessarily happen to him. So he starts to kind of go back and summarize things that happened to Dorantes, Castillo, and other Spanish survivors who potentially are no longer alive, or, something else has happened to them. So this is a little bit strange, and they talk about this in the intro. They mention at this point, his account sort of becomes an account within an account within another account. Because in some cases, he's really delivering information that he's come by like at a third-hand remove. Not only did these things not happen to him directly, in some cases they happen to, these guys that he's talking to, but in other cases, the guys that he's talking to are telling him about things that happen to other guys. So he's getting this information at several removes, and then he's relating it to us, but it's not always 100% clear that he had not been present while a lot of that stuff was going on. He had been separated from the other Spaniards. I believe he falls ill at one point on the mainland. So when a lot of the Spaniards and the Native Americans who they are living with return to Mojado, which they do kind of on a seasonal basis, it seems. They kind of go back and forth from the island to the mainland, mostly in search of food, it seems like. But he's left behind because he's sick. And that's really when he gets separated from the other Spaniards, and he does not see them again, like we said, for about 4.5 years. So things do get narratively complex around this roughly halfway point. So just be aware of that. And again, he's kind of going back and summarizing stuff that has happened over these last 4.5 years when he's been cut off from all of the other survivors. But then we return to his normal sort of present tense first-person narrative style once he and his fellow survivors sort of get together and decide, hey, we need to get out of here. We need to find some more friendly people or some more favorable sort of material circumstances, and that's when they start pushing southward towards the Rio Grande, and that's when things really change for them. But some other things to just keep in mind if we're considering, Cabeza de Vaca's style and the way he sort of constructs his narrative, just notice that sometimes he will stop his narration rather abruptly to discuss various things that he observes. Again, some of these anthropological, or we might call them ethnographic details. Remember, ethnography is the branch of anthropology that's really concerned with other cultures and like the customs and conventions of other cultures. So as he spends more and more time with Native Americans, he does, as I told you guys last week, he starts to pay more attention, not just to their physical characteristics and not just to whether or not they are hostile to him and his fellow Europeans, but also, just to their practices, their customs, their family relations, their views on religion, medicine, how frequently they seem to be engaged in armed conflict with other people, all of those things, what they eat. All of that becomes more interesting to him, more important to him, and he provides details about that stuff. He also provides detail about flora and fauna, the plants and the animals that he encounters during his travels, and other specific details. So we like those details, and they are helpful, I think, to readers, but sometimes it's a little confusing. Again, the editors talk about this. He'll stop the narrative to share details, but sometimes those are details that he learned at some different time. Like it'll seem like he learned those details at this particular point in the narrative where we're kind of stopping, but in reality he learned that stuff earlier, or he would learn it much later, but he just finds it convenient to put that information at that particular point, which really is his prerogative. I mean, he's the writer, and I think it works pretty well. But again, just be aware that he is at times moving stuff around in terms of his time sequence. Not everything is strictly linear. There's even that weird point near the very end of the narrative where he goes back and talks about what happened to the guys back on the Florida Peninsula who stayed aboard the ships when the rest of the expedition went overland to try to find stuff. So that seems rather late in the game to talk about those people. And don't feel too concerned about keeping track with this rather large cast of various, survivors and other members of the expedition. As some of you pointed out in the week 1 discussion, there aren't a lot of well-developed characters here for us to really care about. I would say the only ones you need to know on any sort of, in-depth level would obviously be Cabeza de Vaca himself, the star in his own mind, at least, and then the other three survivors, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio. They mention a lot of other people, but because we don't have much character development as readers, we don't typically feel very invested in a lot of these other members of the expedition. So don't worry if you're struggling to keep track, but do use the footnotes just to kind of make sure that you have a general idea of what's going on. But at this point, the expedition as we knew it, much like a lot of the other standards and sort of expectations based on their European culture, their European sort of colonial, conquistador, almost medieval sort of worldview. That's something that a lot of critics have pointed out. Like, these are very early modern people, almost medieval still. Cabeza de Vaca, his fellow colonists. So they have a particular perspective that's very much informed by where they come from, their own culture, their own ways. So like I said last time, I mentioned this last time, that's the prism through which they see everything in the Americas. Initially, they're comparing everything to what they know back in the old world, back in Spain. But as the narrative progresses, they have to formulate new conceptions. They have to sort of move away from those old world European notions about what's good, what's right, what's normal, what's to be expected, because they're in a new place and they have to adapt. So we can even think of the expedition itself. Like, the expedition is over by the time these guys reach Mojado. There's no more Navarrez expedition. There are survivors who are simply trying to live. But there's no more expedition. There's no more real mission of conquest or exploration. That's all over with, along with a lot of the other things they held dear as Europeans. So that's the way a lot of critics read this story, and why it's often thought of as kind of maybe the first American story and sort of the way we think of the Americas, because it's really about people from some other part of the world coming here, having to leave their old sort of expectations and perceptions behind because they're in a new place, dealing with new people, and they ultimately establish new identities. So that's something that we can think about this week. Does Cabeza de Vaca sort of reformulate his own identity? Is this sort of a story of self-making, remaking? That's a very American story, isn't it? People immigrating here, people coming here to find a new life, maybe a better life, and becoming Americans in the process. Some critics read that basic process as happening to Cabeza de Vaca as well, just in a very strange way. So we can sort of, debate that, think about that. There's a notion that I want us to return to today called transculturation. And again, this is sort of a concept handed down from the social sciences, from anthropology, really. It's this notion that when different cultures come into contact with one another, there's usually a sort of give and take, right? A sort of cultural exchange that takes place. And many have pointed out that this can happen even if those two cultures are kind of hostile to one another, right? Even if it's not a strictly peaceful encounter, there's still going to be cultural exchange. One group of people sort of passes on a cultural practice to the other group, while that other group passes on or gives something to the first group. So, there's some type of exchange or melding process. Some people look at it as sort of like the creation of cultural hybridity, kind of a hybrid, a combination of multiple cultures. Are we seeing that develop here as we watch the four survivors get more and more ingrained into some of these native societies? So the first point at which we start to really observe this is on page 93. If you guys want to turn there, at least this is one of the first pivotal points that I've identified. Maybe you guys can find some others, but this is the place, this is the point at which they're first asked to serve as physicians. Okay? And this is a really interesting moment. So I want to explore this particular passage, and we'll talk about what it means when they start to practice medicine and how that changes their sort of social roles. But I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself. Before we get to that point, I wanted to share a few more things just to clean up a little bit from last week. I mentioned the publication history. I just wanted to briefly get through this because it's in my notes right here. And I kind of botched this info last week. I mentioned that this 1542 edition of Cabeza de Vaca's narrative is not the only one that exists. And again, he was the treasurer, so it was his responsibility to write the official account, or the official relation. And we noticed that he begins doing that on Cuba before the expedition even departs. And obviously he's unable to keep written records during his wanderings, during this long trek, but we see that he does get back to writing after they sort of, get rescued, if you want to call it that, or once they encounter other Spaniards in Mexico. Then later in 1536, he writes a joint report with Castillo and Durantes. So I got this wrong last time. I said that Castillo and Durantes were working independently of him, but in reality, all three wrote that joint report together before returning to Spain. And then later, Cabeza de Vaca writes his own account, his own sort of narrative based on the notes that he's already taken and also based on the joint account. But he writes his own relation between 1538 and 1540, and then it's published a couple of years after that. So it's just important to keep that in mind when you're using the footnotes, because the joint report that Cabeza de Vaca wrote along with Castillo and Durantes would later become the basis of a work of history written by a Spanish historian named Oviedo. And you're going to see that name a lot in the footnotes. So don't get confused by all of that. The editors are using that work of history by Oviedo to often sort of cross-check or like cross-reference information that's found in this 1542 version of the relation. So often they find that the information or the details kind of corroborated. There are a few small discrepancies between Oviedo's history and what Cabeza de Vaca is setting down here. But for the most part, there's a lot of similarities. So the editors mention that. So just keep that in mind as you're reading the footnotes and you see the name Oviedo. Just remember that's the historian who used the joint account as sort of a basis of his own historical work, and that's being used here to check some of Cabeza de Vaca's details to see if some things may have been changed later when he was writing with Durantes and Castillo. But again, they find that a lot of the stuff that's here also appears in more or less a similar form in Oviedo's history. But when there are discrepancies, they'll point those out in the footnote. So there are a few places where what Oviedo says in the history contradicts what Cabeza de Vaca says here. Again, doesn't happen a lot, but it does happen a few times. And one of those times, I believe, is when they make the decision to stop hugging the coastline as they head south through Mexico and to go overland. There's still some debate as to why exactly they do that. And it's one of those many moments where Cabeza de Vaca does not really fully explain it, or he has his reasons, but they might be more of an exercise in self-justification than anything else. So again, I just wanted to kind of remind us that before we get to this pivotal scene on page 93, just remember when they're on the peninsula of Florida early in their travels, Cabeza de Vaca does make some notes about the Native Americans. He notes that they are tall, they are well built, usually naked. He notes that they are skilled in the arts of archery, bow and arrow. But that's kind of it. He doesn't share a lot of other information about them other than some kind of stereotypical cliched stuff. Like at one point, this is later, I believe they're on Mojado by this point. Yeah, page 88. The Spaniards are very worried when the natives begin to have some kind of ritual and they're dancing and celebrating, and the Spaniards assume that this is a prelude to some kind of human sacrifice. Why do they think that? And that's wrong, but why do they think that? Because they read the account of Cortez in Mexico. They read the letters of relation or the expedition narrative that Cortez wrote about his conquest in Mexico previously. And Cortez talks about human sacrifice taking place there in certain kind of ritual formations. So they read that and they assume they're going to experience something similar here on Mojado, but these particular natives do not seem to have the same cultural practices. So again, the Spaniards are assuming that all Native Americans are essentially the same. And if, the native tribes that Cortez encountered in Mexico did something, then obviously these other natives will be doing it too. But what we come to realize as readers, and I think Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow survivors come to realize this as well, is that there are a lot of different native cultures. A lot of different kinds of people with different ways of life, different sort of worldviews, different attitudes towards Europeans, certainly. And it's not a monolith. There's a lot of different cultural practices on display here. And as they travel, Cabeza de Vaca becomes more attuned to the differences between people. And he starts to record some of these differences. But just notice that early in the narrative, certainly back when they're in the peninsula of Florida, he doesn't have that level of observation or interest. But because of necessity, because of survival, he starts to notice a lot more. And that's why some people read him, though it's still debatable, some people do read him as kind of becoming a sort of amateur ethnographer as the narrative wears on. But now let's get to this passage on page 93. That full paragraph beginning on that island about which I have spoken. He tells us, they tried to make us physicians without examining us or asking us for our titles. That line always makes me laugh because, again, it's another example of how Cabeza de Vaca is using these sort of European standards, these European perspectives to govern his worldview, his expectations, his experiences, really of everything. So he's sort of outraged that the natives on Mojado would ask them to be physicians without, quote, examining us or asking us for our titles. So he's thinking about customs back home in Spain. He's thinking about the qualifications that one would need to be a physician back in Spain or back, somewhere in Western Europe. And the natives here are doing something different. So his initial response and the response of his companions is pretty scornful because this is not how they do things back home. So their initial reaction is, oh, this is wrong, this is absurd, we're not going to do this. So let's read on. So they tried to make us physicians without examining us or asking us for our titles, because they cure illnesses by blowing on the sick person. And with that breath of air and their hands, they expel the disease from him. So he's describing these medical practices of the natives that they're currently living with on the island. And they demanded that we do the same and make ourselves useful. And then read the next sentence. Now, we laughed about this. We laughed about this, saying that it was a mockery and we did not know how to cure. So notice that sort of arrogant reaction, and perhaps it's understandable at first. The Europeans have no real frame of reference for what the natives are doing and what the natives are asking them to do. So their reaction is to laugh. They're scornful. They laugh. They say, of course we can't. We're not doctors. We're not qualified to be doctors. We don't have medical training. We don't have the proper credentials. We can't do that. And it's almost comical to them that the natives would think that they could. But now let's read on. And because of this, because they're laughing and refusing, because of this, they, the Native Americans, took away our food until we did as they told us. So now we see that really they don't have a choice. This was not a suggestion. This was not a question. This was more of an order. So eventually they have to comply, and they have to start functioning as physicians. They have to start healing people. And it's interesting how this develops over the narrative. They're very reluctant at first. Cabeza de Vaca just tells us that this is something that they don't have any background in. They don't think they're capable of doing it. But they start doing it because if they don't, they'll have their food taken away. And as they do it more, and as they encounter other groups who are more friendly towards them, again, their social status changes, and the way they view the healing also will start to change. So that's really important. That happens, I think, pretty early on, once they land on Mojado. But then again, Cabeza de Vaca gets separated at various times. It can be hard to keep track. But he's separated, he's living alone, away from the other Spaniards, and he serves in a few different roles during those years. For a while, he is enslaved. Another thing that he sort of, declines to really elaborate upon. He doesn't really dramatize it the way we might expect. But at other times, he seems to work sort of like a merchant, where he's afforded some degree of freedom and mobility. He's able to move around, and it seems like he's engaged in like trading things or trading, various items, working in that capacity. So, and it's true of the other survivors too. We know at various points, Castillo and Dorantes are also enslaved, Estevancio as well, and it seems like they're passing back and forth. They might even get sold, within some of these different groups that are living in coastal Texas. So there's a lot of various exchanges and sort of networks of exchange that never get fully explained in the narrative. Again, as readers, we don't quite learn how these transactions work, nor do we fully understand like the sort of movements of the men. We know that they're often following food. They're often sort of just under orders to go to a certain place, do a certain thing. When the group that they're with is going to the mainland, that typically means they're going to the mainland as well. When they're going back to Mojado, that's what the men have to do. So we know by the spring of 1533, Cabeza de Vaca is being held by the Mariames. That's one of the local tribes here in coastal Texas, or some sort of group affiliated with the Mariames, or sort of a kinship group. Not 100% sure, but the Mariames are the ones who often seem to enslave him. They seem to be a pretty warlike group, sort of hostile to the Europeans, and they often force them to work as slaves, like digging up roots, doing other really hard manual labor. And they also are currently holding Dorantes at this point in the spring of 1533. And we know that at some point Cabeza de Vaca is able to escape from them. He's sort of fleeing from them. He describes their attempts to find him, to track him down, and maybe even to kill him. So by page 112, he is fleeing down the coastline with the other three survivors, Dorantes, Castillo, and Estevancio. And like I said, this marks the beginning of a very different journey. Okay, so at this point, their days of enslavement, their days of, sort of death defying escapes are largely over. A lot of the conflict and violence that really sort of characterizes the narrative up until this point largely goes away. Things really change in terms of mood and tone. But before we move on to the next, really to like sort of part two, just keep in mind, again, we don't get a lot of details about Cabeza de Vaca's time in slavery. Why is that? That's actually a question I asked in the week one discussion, but we can still think about it here in week two. Why does he gloss over that? Why doesn't he give us more detail about that particular chapter of his travels? He really doesn't talk much about his life during those 4.5 years that he's with the Native Americans only. I mean, he talks about some things. He offers certain details, certain descriptions, but he certainly doesn't offer much about his interior state. And we might notice that's another characteristic of his writing, sort of in general, though there are exceptions. There are moments where he offers a glimpse into his emotional or mental state, but often he does not. Think about why he glosses over the slavery stuff. Think about why he glosses over some of the details about his reunion with the other survivors. Is it just because he's kind of an awkward, non-professional writer? Or does he have a reason to gloss over certain things? Remember, he's writing the king. He's trying to present himself probably in a favorable light. So how do these efforts at self-justification or just a basic interest in how you present yourself, how do those factor in to some of his narrative decisions? I want you guys to consider that. All right, so they start heading down the coastline. They're really just kind of running away from the Merriames and the other sort of related groups that are trying to enslave and or kill them. And before long, they reach a group known as the Avivares, I believe is how to say. I'm not quite sure if that's the right pronunciation, but the Avivares are the first group that not only sort of take them in and care for them, they've already been cared for and helped by many different Native American groups, going all the way back to their Gulf Coast travels on the rafts. It's important to keep that in mind. The only reason they're still alive, really, is because they were able to receive aid from some groups in coastal Texas that kind of, gave them food, gave them some, basic necessities when they first crash landed there. But it seems like they're kind of in a constant sort of alternating cycle with the coastal Texas groups. Some seem to be friendly and let them function maybe as merchants or traders, whereas others like the Merriames seem much more hostile and more inclined to just treat them as, just use them as slave labor. But once they go further south and they encounter the Avivares, they get much better treatment. Right? This is in the Prickly Pear region, just north of the Rio Grande. So again, very close to the modern day U.S.-Mexico border. And they live with the Avivares for several months, we think. And again, they're probably living with different groups or sort of like subgroups within that larger tribal designation. Again, we're not 100% sure, really. Historians talk about the fact that it's difficult to really identify exactly which groups Cabeza de Vaca is talking about at times, because a lot of the sort of names or designations that he's using would be sort of defunct by the time widespread European colonization would make these tribes better known to, Western Europeans, Anglo settlers. Things changed rapidly over the next few hundreds of years, largely because of Spanish colonization. A lot of these tribal groups might have broken up, might have been wiped out. They might have migrated, moved away from the region. It's hard to know for certain, but no doubt some of these groups identified here would be the descendants, would be the forefathers or, the ancestors of the tribes that would later be encountered in places like Texas and northern Mexico by the Spanish, by Anglo, English-speaking settlers in, 1800s. But by the time that happens, again, a lot's changed. A lot of these local native societies have been very disrupted. And in some cases, wiped clean off the map. And we're going to see that process begin to unfold a little bit more further to the south as Cabeza de Vaca and his companions go into Mexico. But again, some confusion about, some of these groups and what to call them, but they're with the Avivares for a while. And it's with them that they first start to work consistently as healers, as curers, right? So we know they've already been doing some of this back in the Galveston Bay, but it wasn't as consistent. Now it kind of becomes their full-time job. And not just with the Avivares, but also with other groups that they will meet subsequently. So if you look on page 114, the first footnote there, according to our editors and historical sources like Oviedo, from this point on, really, Cabeza de Vaca and his companions lived in, quote, complete freedom with these Native Americans. And though they did suffer at times from hunger and the elements, and they were sort of in a constant search for food, they were treated well. Whatever the Native Americans had, these guys had. They were no longer subjected to harsh treatment or enslavement. So it marks a huge change. And as they continue to push south, they're going to meet more and more settled civilizations. So I mentioned this a little bit last week. The Avivares are friendly, but they don't have a lot of resources. They're following food. They're sort of described as sort of a poor people. But as Cabeza de Vaca and company continue to go south, they're going to meet more prosperous societies. They're going to meet, again, societies that seem to be more agricultural. They're growing their own crops. They're often more peaceful than those sort of semi-nomadic coastal Texas groups that they were with previously. These people have settled villages, right? Sort of permanent homes. They have like more sort of material resources, maybe more technology in some cases. And this makes a big difference. This makes a big impact on how Cabeza de Vaca and the others are able to live. So we can track that as we move through. Just wanted to point out a few other things sort of as we go. Notice the biblical reference on page 115. We get a burning bush here, very reminiscent of what we see in the book of Exodus. The location where Moses is appointed by God to lead the Israelites out of Egypt. So keep that in mind. This is an allusion. This is a reference which we don't get very much of in the narrative. Again, something that we might expect to find in a traditional work of literature, right? This sort of reference to a famous episode from the Bible. And there's also some probable symbolic importance here. It seems like perhaps Cabeza de Vaca wants to compare himself to Moses. Maybe he is also trying to lead his men out of Egypt and, lead them to the promised land. I mean, there's a lot of religious implications that he doesn't always necessarily elaborate upon. He does mention his own religious faith, but this is one of the few moments where we get kind of somewhat of a literary move, I would say, just by bringing in a biblical reference. and with all the symbolic weight that sort of brings to the table, that's kind of a literary move. A lot of fiction writers would do that. So notice that as well. And notice what we do learn, what little we learn about sort of indigenous religious belief that might be tied up with certain ideas about solar deities. And this is interesting because, again, it's something that Cabeza de Vaca himself never probably fully understands, but he does recognize that the Avivares and some of their sort of related kin seem to regard him and his fellow survivors as children of the sun. And they seem to believe that Cabeza de Vaca and the other three guys have, the power to heal. So they sort of become shamans or healers. And the question we have to ask ourselves, it appears in a footnote on page 118, are they great shamans because they really can perform these cures? Or are they performing the cures because they are perceived as great shamans? So it's a question that a lot of anthropologists have sort of batted around in different contexts. So another thing to consider, we get a brief glimpse at a bit of native folklore on page 119. We might consider this a little bit of a trickster tale, and keep in mind trickster tales because we're going to be reading some of them next week. This is quite different than the trickster tales we're going to look at in week 3. It's a little bit frightening. But again, notice that tale from page 119 to page 120. And again, notice the Spaniards' reaction to it. Again, sort of rejecting certain aspects of these new cultures that they encounter while hanging on to some of their older European beliefs. But in time, like we've said, that will change. As we move along, there's more and more ethnographic details sprinkled throughout the pages. His cultural understanding is shifting. It is developing. But a few things to note. Beginning around page 130, he starts to offer this really pretty well-detailed and carefully constructed catalog of all of the different nations and languages that he encountered between Mojado and the modern-day U.S.-Mexico border, roughly, where the Rio Grande River is. He throws in notes about kind of where they're located spatially, the alliances they have, the wars between them, what they smoke, what they drink, various details of their social organization. I mean, even going back to Mojado, he starts to notice things like ritual weeping, certain kind of piercings that different groups have, family dynamics. He's noticing more and more of these ethnographic details. However, as the footnote on, I believe, 124 points out, from this page onward, he ceases to refer to any other groups that he meets by name. Once they push kind of beyond the Avivares and the Rio Grande, he meets a lot of other tribes, a lot of other people, but he stops naming them. Up until that point, he's been providing names for all of the different tribes that he's describing, but he stops, and we're not exactly sure why. Maybe he just finds it difficult to keep up. I think it's also likely that a lot of the groups they meet once they cross into Mexico seem to be related, either by kinship ties or maybe like military or political allegiances, alliances. They might speak languages that are somewhat mutually intelligible. It just seems like the cultural landscape changes. Back in coastal Texas, he seems very aware of the differences between different groups. So these are the ones that enslave us. These are the ones that are more friendly. These are the Avivares. They're pretty nice. These are some other people that we've met. or have been told about. But maybe it becomes more difficult to do that once they move into these more settled, these more sort of agricultural, peaceful societies where there seems to, in general, be a little bit less conflict, less warfare. They're certainly treated better. So maybe his conditions lead him to have a more difficult time sort of noticing differences between larger groups. I'm not sure. Maybe he just doesn't bother to identify different groups, or maybe he's just no longer really aware of them, or no longer thinks that they're terribly important. But going back to this idea of transculturation, one example that some critics will give when they make the case that, hey, this is kind of a narrative of cultural hybridity, the remaking of this man, this sort of classic Spanish conquistador, sort of a chauvinist, a European chauvinist. He thinks his ways are the best ways. He's serving the crown. He's a loyal soldier. And over the course of the narrative, he really stops being those things. He's not really a soldier anymore. He's not really working in the service of the crown anymore. He's just trying to survive. His expedition has been a complete failure, and he becomes a shaman. He becomes a healer. He becomes sort of a member of these local native communities. So a lot of people think, oh, well, this is a story of transculturation. And again, a big example they look at is the healing itself. How do they heal? What are their techniques? Well, it's kind of a combination of old world European practices and new Native American cultures that they've, become exposed to. So they are practicing some of the ritual blowing that the natives do, like blowing on the affected area, sort of using their hands and their breath to sort of extract whatever it is that's ailing the person. But they also do another thing that becomes very important and becomes emulated, by the natives as well, and that is the sign of the cross, a traditional Catholic maneuver that they are, of course, bringing with them from their old culture. So a lot of readers and critics point to that and say, okay, well, maybe that is an example of transculturation. We have this combination of Catholicism on one side and native beliefs on the other. One thing that's interesting to note is Cabeza de Vaca and his companions, they don't really convert the Native Americans to Catholicism. That would happen on a large scale. Of course, it was already happening in other parts of Mexico, but they don't quite have the ability to pull that off. They have to sort of work within the cultural framework of the Native Americans' existing practices. But again, this is kind of a hybrid. This is a combination of Native American practice and these men's old world religion that's, soon to be enforced, but hasn't yet taken hold with this particular group of Native Americans. So that's interesting to note. You don't have to necessarily buy that as an example of transculturation. That just might be a cynical survival tactic employed by Cabeza de Vaca and his friends. Just they figure, hey, this is the best way for us to be sort of important and to be valued by these people. If we can be healers, be physicians, shamans, whatever you want to call it, that gives us some real sort of status, and that's going to keep us alive, that's going to keep us fed, and maybe that's the only reason they're doing it. But it is interesting to sort of think about. And there is a point, I thought I had it written down here, I'm not finding it at the moment, but there is a point in the narrative where Cabeza de Vaca claims that he was really the best healer out of all of them. Like, they all did it, but he claims that he was sort of the most adept. So we have to wonder, do these guys come to believe in their own healing power? Because remember their first response back on page 93, they laugh. They laugh about it. We're not doctors. We haven't been trained. But do they eventually come to think that they can do it? Or are they just sort of playing along as part of, are they just participating in this cultural practice because it's their best avenue towards health and survival? You guys should think about that, reach your own conclusions. But there's an interesting custom that Cabeza de Vaca observes, and again, he doesn't really understand it, but he observes it and he talks about it beginning on page 135. And this is referred to by the editors as ritual pillaging and exchange. And it's kind of a weird thing, but it has to do probably with Cabeza de Vaca and his fellow survivors and the reputations that they ultimately gain from their healing practices. So whenever they go on to a new village, they're always kind of on the move, right? And they sort of gain this large following of Native American allies. And whenever they come across a new village or a new group of Native Americans, the natives who are already accompanying them will basically steal the possessions and sack the villages of the new group that have come to have their sick cured. And again, this practice at first kind of horrifies the Spaniards. They're like, wait, you can't do this. You can't come in here to this new village and steal these people's possessions. Like, that's not right. But they quickly realize that they're kind of the reason for it, right? Like their arrival has been announced. Like Estevancio often goes ahead of them and sort of tells the next village, hey, the healers are coming, so get ready. Get your sick people ready because the healers are going to be here, tomorrow or later today, and they're going to be ready to see your sick. So it's almost like this exchange, right? The new group wants their sick to be cured, and in exchange, they seem willing to give up a lot of their possessions to the natives who have already fallen in with the Spaniards. But Cabeza de Vaca kind of tries to discourage this at first. And he's like, whoa, no, I don't know if I'm comfortable with that. But then he's reassured. They tell him, the Native Americans tell him, oh, don't worry. Don't worry. The group that's getting pillaged now, they're going to fall in with us. They're going to travel with us to the next village. And then they're going to be able to pillage that village. So they're going to eventually get to do to somebody else what we are doing to them right now. And the exchange will continue. So he can't really tell what's going on. He's not really approving of it. And he also noticed that, a lot of these new native groups are kind of afraid of them, in some cases, afraid of their powers. And again, some of their Native American companions seem to be taking advantage of that. Like, if they're not getting what they want from the new group, they'll be like, hey, if you're not careful, you don't want to make these guys mad because they have the power, to kill you. So you better do what we say. So Cabeza de Vaca starts to get a sense that maybe some of their traveling companions are taking advantage of these other groups, kind of using the healers' reputations to make money or sort of take advantage of others, and that's possible. But I think as readers, we just don't know. We don't know if this is a long-standing custom, if it's just kind of a particular way to practice hospitality, or if it's a new circumstance brought about by Cabeza de Vaca and these other children of the sun, right? Remember, for a lot of Native Americans, they had probably never seen white people before. Again, we don't really know exactly which ones had and which ones had not, but many of them likely had not, since the Spaniards had not made much progress, much in the way of inroads into the future U.S. The English had not come over yet. So for many, seeing white men with beards maybe would have been enough to make them think, oh, these are these are special kinds of people, these are divine beings, these are, our because some of them did have solar deities who maybe resembled the Spaniards in some kind of way. But it's also fair to think that some of the Native Americans knew very well that this was a little bit of a scam. Again, Cabeza de Vaca seems a little bit suspicious of that. So maybe there were some cynical sort of opportunists here who were just using this as a money-making scheme. And then it's probably true that others really believed that they were healers based on their own religious beliefs or based on what they had heard, what they had been told by their neighbors, friends, family members, or whatever. So it's hard to know. It's hard to navigate some of these cultural practices because our narrator does not understand them himself. So he's not really sure. That means that we are often not sure. But then moving on, so this is not long after this, on page 138, Cabeza de Vaca begins to maybe provide some more self-justification as he talks about hearing of groups further inland who had more food, were more well-established, had nicer villages, maybe even practiced metalworking, which to the Spaniards was a real sign of progress and sophistication. So this is offered as one possible reason why they stop heading south down the coastline and they start pushing inland. And as I mentioned last week, they will eventually go all the way across the breadth of Mexico and end up in northwestern Mexico, not far from the South Sea, what they called the Pacific Ocean. And at some later point, it seems like they want to get to the South Sea. Like they later recross the Rio Grande, they meet the people of the cows, and that might have been the group that they were hearing about. This is a pretty advanced society. Again, they have settled, permanent homes. They practice wide-scale, large-scale agriculture. Cabeza de Vaca refers to them as having great vitality and capacity. He says they best understood us and responded to what we asked them. So they're probably back in Texas at that point, or they're maybe just south of Texas across the Rio Grande. What he's describing as cows were almost certainly buffalo, who of course roamed free throughout that part of the world during this time. So at some point they start to hear that, all right, we might be closer to the South Sea than we are to Panuco. So at that point, if they had not already, they pretty much abandoned trying to get to Panuco, going the way of Panuco, and they just commit to pushing west. And that's how they eventually end up meeting other Spaniards in northwestern Mexico. But again, do we know exactly why they make that decision? No, we have some reasons from Cabeza de Vaca, and again, another reason might have been that they realized near the coast they encounter more sort of hostile groups of hunter-gatherer types, whereas when they push inland, they tend to find groups that raise crops, that have permanent homes, more food, are a little bit friendlier, and want them to work exclusively as healers. So there was probably a lot of factors that went into their decision to cross overland, but it certainly extends their journey. They might have also just gotten lost, we don't know for sure, but like I said last week, if they had just kept pushing south, going in the direction that they were going in, they would have eventually reached Panuco. They actually weren't that far. If you look at the map, they were not that far away when they decide to change their route drastically and start heading north and west. But eventually it works out and they do avoid being enslaved or being sort of put in harm's way, because for the rest of the narrative, they are healers, they are important, and they eventually gain thousands of followers, which is kind of remarkable as well as they continue to sort of trek across Mexico. So again, they find themselves in a more populous area. Their reputation as healers precedes them. So, they become kind of celebrities to a certain extent. It's really interesting to think about sort of how they are functioning within this larger sort of cultural fabric. And obviously their presence, their arrival has changed things already with these people. And more change is coming soon because, and remember, a lot of these particular native groups have not yet encountered the Spaniards, at least not in a significant way, but that is going to change soon as the Spaniards continue their mission of conquest. Those were the main narrative points that I wanted to hit. I did want to come back a little bit to Estevancio, who we have mentioned before. Remember, he was a slave originally from, we think, Morocco. He was almost certainly born an Arabic-speaking Muslim who was forced to convert to Catholicism, most likely as a Spanish slave, learned to speak Spanish. And we also learned that he really functions as their interpreter and their guide. If you look on page 153, Cabeza de Vaca refers to him as the black man. That's the phrase that he always uses. He doesn't expound very much on what Estevancio does, but we do learn that it's often him, Estevancio, along with some of their native companions, who will go ahead to the next village or the next settlement and sort of announce the arrival of the healers, sort of set the stage for the next cultural exchange that's going to take place. He's often, out there sort of scouting, looking for their next destination. So he has an obvious facility with language. It seems like he's learning some of these other languages. We're unsure how much Cabeza de Vaca, Dorantes, and Castillo learn other languages. It would stand to reason that they had to learn at least some. But it seems like Estevancio really functions more as an interpreter. It seems like he might possess more knowledge of these different languages and these different cultures that they're encountering. So it is interesting to realize that 3 of the 4 survivors get to write down their accounts. Estevancio was the one who never did. Obviously, as a slave, he was not afforded that same opportunity. It would be interesting to know what his story was, what his own personal account might be. And if you're interested in that character, I did just want to recommend a book that came out not long ago, back in 2015, called The Moor's Account, written by Layla Lalami. It was actually a Pulitzer Prize winner. Well, I'm sorry, it was a finalist. It was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize in fiction. It didn't win, but it was one of the finalists. So again, it's called The Moor's Account. And it's basically this same story told from Estevancio's perspective. So if you guys are interested, I would check out that novel. It's really good. The Moor's Account by Layla Lalami. So anyway, as they continue to push towards the Pacific, they start to see signs of Spaniards. So they do suspect that they're getting closer. And that's also when they begin to hear rumors of these Spanish slaving expeditions in this part of northwestern Mexico. So they're now in a part of Mexico that had really been conquered just a few years earlier in 1531 by Guzman, one of these Spanish conquistadors. So they start to hear about these slaving expeditions, and they're hearing some of this from Native Americans themselves, right? So around this point, we hear Cabeza de Vaca sort of faithfully record some of the natives' own tales of horror that have been inflicted by the Spanish. And then he also starts to offer his own advice about what to do with these Native Americans. And when they do eventually meet up with other Spaniards, he even tells them, like, hey, these guys that I'm traveling with, these people, they're friendly. They grow crops. They're not that dissimilar from us. I think they would make very good subjects of the crown. So he's advocating for sort of good treatment. He has no problem with these people being forced to convert to Catholicism, sort of being made, vassals of the king, but he wants them to be treated more or less decently, whereas his fellow Spaniards are going around murdering, raping, and often enslaving the natives that they encounter. So he's kind of horrified by that. He says, wait a minute, you don't need to do that. These people will work with us if we just treat them well. But that's not really what the other Spaniards that he meets are interested in doing. So this is a very, interesting point here in the narrative where we have to start making some decisions about, how we feel about Cabeza de Vaca. But it is just worth pointing out, this is a fun passage, I think, on page 159. So they know they're getting close to finding other Spaniards by this point, but they're not quite sure how close. So this is an interesting detail that Cabeza de Vaca includes. On 159, he says, that night, this is about midway through that full paragraph on 159, that night I entreated one of my companions to go after the Christians, the Spaniards, who were going through the area where we were leaving the land secured. And it was a 3-day journey. But again, here, if you look at the footnote, Cabeza de Vaca is using information that he would gain later. Like, he only learns later that it's a 2-day journey from where they are at this point and where the other Spaniards are. So he doesn't know that. He's acting like he knew that when he was telling his fellow Spaniards, hey, let's go and find these guys. But they didn't know how far away they were at that time. It was a 3-day journey. This they judged a troublesome undertaking, excusing themselves because of fatigue and hardship. So he's talking about Dorantes and Castillo, right? He wouldn't consider Estevancio to be his companion, right? He would consider Estevancio beneath him. So he's talking about his other two fellow white Spaniards. And he's saying they begged off because they said, essentially, they were tired and they had been through a lot. So he says they excused themselves because of fatigue and hardship, in spite of the fact that each one of them would be able to do it better than I on account of being hardier and younger. So just a little subtle jab that he takes at those two guys here, where he's like, even though they're younger and stronger than me, they didn't want to make the trip, so I ended up going with Estevancio. Let's read on. But seeing their will, the next day in the morning, I took with me the black man and 11 Indians. And following the trail of the Christians that I found, I passed through 3 places where they had slept. And this day I went 10 leagues, so on and so forth. And eventually they find the other Spaniards. But again, notice that he acts like he's the leader of the expedition. I reached 4 Christians. I did this. I took with me. I went this distance. But he's got 11 Native Americans with him and Estevancio with him. So when he first meets the other Spaniards, that's who he has with him. Not Dorantes and Castillo, Estevancio and a bunch of Native American allies. So, of course, the Spaniards are surprised to find him so strangely dressed and in the company of Indians. So just a kind of funny moment there, but also important because it's Estevancio who goes with him, and it's probably Estevancio who knows the way or who has gathered more intelligence about the landscape, the neighboring tribes, and maybe distances, because he's the one, not the white Spaniards, but Estevancio is the one often functioning as interpreter and guide. But yeah, when they meet the other Spaniards, it's not exactly a harmonious coming together. They don't really get along with the other Spaniards. Again, Cabeza de Vaca is kind of horrified at their methods, the fact that they're enslaving the Native Americans. He's like, that's really not the way to go about it. So he offers his own advice, his own take on sort of what they need to do in order to subdue this large Native American population. And he claims that, hey, they'll be good subjects, they'll be good Catholics. Let's just bring them under our sort of cultural umbrella. Let's just assimilate them into our way of life. That's better than all of this violence and brutality. So like I said, about 50, 60, 70 years ago, that perspective, that take that he shares with us was enough to convince a lot of readers and scholars and critics, again, that he was kind of a benevolent conquistador, that he wasn't like the other colonists, he wasn't like the other conquerors. He had real sympathy and real respect for the Native Americans that he had been living with for all of these years. But nowadays, I think there's been sort of a pushback against that common reading. And a lot of more contemporary scholars and readers say he's just another tool of empire. He's just another tool of colonization. He just wants to go about it in a slightly more gentle way. Maybe he's not in favor of slavery, but he's still in favor of ripping the natives' culture and their own native practices away from them. So even though he's been practicing a lot of these native customs, a lot of these native, medicinal and religious practices, he's more than happy to make them all Catholic, make them all subjects of the Spanish king, make them grow crops for us. And he thinks that would be fine for the Spanish and for the natives. So that rubs a lot of people the wrong way. Others will point out that he's still kind of a prisoner of his own identity as a Spanish colonist. Right? And even though he's been living in this very different way, once he meets other Spaniards, once he kind of gets brought back into normal, mainstream sort of Spanish society, he can't very well say, hey, let's all live with the natives and maybe we can be shamans like me and my buddies and it can be great. We'll all just live together in one big happy family. So reach your own conclusions about him and about what he says, particularly around like 157. Reach your own conclusions about this man, this narrator, this conquistador, his views towards natives, and his sort of vision of how the Spanish and the natives can live together. Think about what all of that means and how you feel about it. So if you look at the discussion post this week, I just threw a lot of words out there because a lot of critics talk about the change that does occur to Cabeza de Vaca. Even if he doesn't become totally sympathetic by the narrative's end, we definitely notice that he's very much changed. A lot of different words have been used to describe that change. And I list some of those words in the discussion prompt. So transformation, conversion, that has some religious undertones, alteration, hybridity, think about cultural hybridity, heterogeneity, transculturation, that sort of collision of cultures that yields a certain exchange of cultures, in-betweenness, going native. So just think about some of those. That last one might be a little offensive in the modern day, but these are all real descriptors that people have used at various times to describe what happens to Cabeza de Vaca. So look at those words, pick one or two that you think is apt. And then you can take a look at a pretty famous quote by the 20th century American author Henry Miller when he talks about the story of Cabeza de Vaca's illumination, how he sort of wipes away the sins of all these other colonists and conquerors because he truly comes to love the Native Americans and appreciate them, and he wants what's best for them. like I said, Henry Miller's a little over the top there, but what he's describing was kind of the popular reading of Cabeza de Vaca decades ago. So do we still agree with that, or do we think he's just another conqueror? He's just another imperialist. Maybe he wants assimilation rather than enslavement, but ultimately he's just another tool of conquest and empire. So how do we see him? How do we read him? How does he strike us today in 2023? So I think that's it. Oh yeah, just a few more quotes. Is this a change of heart? Is he a true advocate for Native Americans? Those are questions that critics have asked. Is he a true advocate? Or is he still really just working on behalf of the Spanish crown? Is this truly a story of transculturation? Do we even believe in the notion of transculturation? Do we think it's even possible? Again, is this the story of one man's personal growth and illumination? Or is it just a weird but still familiar story of conquest in the Americas? All right, so chew on some of those. Let me know if you have any questions, and I will see you guys next week.